see no signs of life. Please don't tell me that the human race did not survive. There are no people in the future. There are no people. There are no people in the future. No people at all. There are no people in the future. Where did all my people go? There are no people in the future. Let me try my people call. Where are all my people? Where are all my people? I guess I'll fly away.
Hey, everybody, welcome. It is Monday, June 19th, 2023. Well, actually, not really. We're pre-recording this ahead of time, but for your purposes, it is Monday, June 19th, 2023. Welcome to Raging Chicken's Out to Coop Live. This is Kevin Mahoney, creator and founder of Raging Chicken. On Out to Coop Live, we talk to progressives, activists, and troublemakers of all sorts, right from our own backyards and from across the country. And you can join us at the end of the week for our Friday Politics Roundup, where we break down the good, the bad, and the ugly in state and national politics. You can get all our shows by subscribing to our podcast on Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support this show by becoming a patron for as little as $5 a month. Head on over to patreon.com/rcpress today. You can help out the show right now by heading over to our YouTube channel if you're not there already. Smash that subscribe button, like the stream for the show, hit that notification bell so you know every time that we go live. And if you're one of our awesome podcast listeners, make sure to leave us that 5-star review on whatever platform you listen on. Leave a comment to let other folks know why you like the show. Little things like this help other people find the show. For more PA Progressive Talk, tune into the Rick Smith Show's live stream at 9 p.m. Eastern on his YouTube channel, Twitter, Facebook, and subscribe to his podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Check out thericksmithshow.com for the latest across all his platforms. And if you haven't already, check out the Sisters of the Night Caucus podcast. The amazing PA women stirring the political cauldron behind this podcast rock the house, and they know where the bodies are buried. Make sure to follow them on Twitter at The Night Caucus. That's at The Night Caucus on Twitter, and subscribe to their podcast on Anchor, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't heard, The Signal is a new podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. The Signal is hosted by the Beacon's editor-in-chief, Cyril Michaleko, and produced by yours truly. Twice a month, The Signal will shine a light on right-wing extremist currents streaming through Bucks County and beyond. Cyril invites guests who can provide insight, analysis, and organizing solutions so that we can steer the community toward calmer, saner, progressive routes. Check them out at thebuckscountybeacon.podbean.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And for all you gamers out there, The Game In is a Quakertown-based black family-owned gaming store. They're friends of the show, and they've got everything from retro N64s, the latest consoles, video games for all platforms, collectibles, action figures, Funko Pops, walls of Funko Pops. And kids get discounts where they get A's in their report cards, which at the end of the year, head on over. Check them out on their Facebook page and follow them on Twitter at The Game In. That's with 2 N's. If you've got a question about a game, look for something hard to get, shoot them a message or drop them an email at thegameinpa@gmail.com. Shout out goes to Jonathan Mann, who wrote our intro song, There Are No People in the Future. Check out all his great stuff on his YouTube page and follow him on Twitter at SongADayMan. That's with 2 N's, at SongADayMan on Twitter. And we can't let Paul Martino, Moms for Liberty, and their oligarch friends buy our schools and push extremist politics in our community. Raging Chicken has teamed up with Levelfield to launch a truly community-rooted PAC to invest in organizing, supporting local and statewide progressive candidates, and unmasking the toxic organizations injecting our communities with right-wing extremism. We're putting small dollar donations to work to beat back the power of big money. You can get more information and drop your donation at ragingchicken.levelfield.net. Well, on today's episode, I welcome Mark Engler to the show. Mark Engler will be here. Yes, we were supposed to have him at the beginning of May, but I had a little quasi-mini family emergency, so I had to kind of postpone, but he was kind enough and gracious enough to kind of come back on the show and reschedule. And we're going to be talking about his article, Can Movements Keep Politicians from Inevitably Selling Out? So it's published in Dissent, The Forge, Waging Nonviolence, and Counterpunch. As communities in Pennsylvania and across the country organize for a more just future in the lead up to municipal elections in the fall and the presidential elections in 2024, it seemed like an opportune moment to be talking about the relationships between social movements and electoral politics. Mark is a writer based in Philly and an editorial board member at Dissent magazine. His latest book, written with Paul Engler, entitled, it's this one right here, by the way, is called This is an Uprising, How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century. It's been called a true masterpiece on the history, logic, ethics, and power of nonviolent action, and a genuine gift to social movements everywhere. Mark's articles on social movements, the global economy, Latin American affairs, militarism, domestic politics, and the environment appear in numerous publications, including The Nation, N+1, Salon, Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, Rolling Stone, The New Republic, Jacobin, Boston Review, San Francisco Chronicle, The Guardian, Mother Jones, In These Times, and many more. And his work has been featured in anthologies including Beautiful Trouble, Liberating Faith, and Democracy in Print, the best of the Progressive Magazine, 1909 to 2009. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Hi, I'm glad to come on and talk with you, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you on. And again, I really appreciate you being willing to reschedule after my last minute family emergency stuff from there. The joys of kids, I tell you.
No problem. Happens to all of us.
Yeah, so like I said in the intro, I was very interested to have you on thinking about right here in Bucks County, there's been a lot of organizing that's been going on, in part because of the extremism around our school boards. But we're also seeing, crisis after crisis that we need to address, whether it's in governing, whether it's in the climate crisis, whether it's in kind of what's happening in kind of immigration and what the climate is going to bring here. All the more reasons why people are organizing and want pushing back. And there's this question that always emerges around elections about whether or not that you go social movements or electoral politics, as if it's this binary split, right? That it's an either or choice. But as you write about in your book, as you talk about even in this article, successful social movements have always kind of been done inside outside strategies, right? They recognize that a political movement is not simply team sport, right? Nor is it some sort of puritanical choice about having to prove that you are one of the faithful, right? It's a much more practical, on the ground kind of building. So I thought in that context, it made a lot of sense to kind of like have you on to talk about this article, and it seemed to be timed pretty well. But before we jump into the article, for those folks who may not be familiar with kind of all your body of work, can you talk a little bit about kind of what's kind of got you to this point? You wanted to focus on these issues of nonviolent kind of organizing and how you see that as kind of relevant to where we are today.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, I work now as a political writer. I live in Philly, but originally I'm from Des Moines, Iowa. I was a kid in the 1980s. Graduated high school and college in the 90s. In terms of my family background, I come out of you could say the peace and justice tradition of the Catholic Church. My dad was actually a priest. My mom had been a nun. They left their vocations. They left their positions in the church to have a family, which was not entirely uncommon, kind of in the post-Vatican II era. But they were supportive of progressive movements, including community organizing efforts in Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. They were supporters of the Catholic Worker Movement, and which would do anti-war actions, do service for the homeless, would do anti-nuclear weapons type of actions. And so I grew up, not as an activist kid who was drugged to protest all the time, but in a world where this was kind of part of the milieu. The Central American Solidarity Movement was part of the milieu. People criticizing Ronald Reagan's foreign policy and support for death squad governments in places like El Salvador and Guatemala. So I grew up with kind of an awareness of that. I actually spent some time in Central America, including a year in Guatemala and El Salvador in the 1980s. Got involved doing environmental activism in high school, including things like campaigns against hog lots, which were just starting to be a thing back then. Now they're all over the place, but confinement, animal operations. In college, I did more student labor organizing, anti-sweatshop organizing. And after college, I worked actually as a political speechwriter in Central America, spent some time out of the country. But this was the period when, what people called the anti-globalization movement, we called it the global justice movement, started to kind of explode on the scene. And so working in Central America, I looked back at the US and I saw a lot of the issues that I cared about coming together in a really interesting way. Which was the international solidarity, the anti-sweatshop work, the labor movement angle, the family farmers, all kind of coming together in this very unusual type of alliance So I came back to the U.S. because I wanted to be doing my own writing and participating in those movements. I was out for the huge protests in Seattle in 1999, which were kind of considered this major coming out party for the global justice movement. Was involved in, me, my younger brother, you mentioned Paul Engler, who I write with, were, both have connections with the labor movement. Our family, we have family members who work in Unite Here, hotel and restaurant workers unions. That was kind of a major source of inspiration for us. But we also experienced these big moments of mass protest in Seattle, in around the Iraq War in 2003, around the immigrant rights movement in 2006. Every so often, you'd have a big explosion of mass protest, and so these are all movements kind of I've been a part of over the years. I wrote a first book that was about globalization politics and about the global justice movement, a lot about what was going on in Latin America. But then, and that came out in 2008, and then Paul and I, kind of after Occupy and after the Arab Spring and all of those kind of mass protests that exploded around 2011, we sort of decided, well, we really wanted to write about these movement moments, these moments of mass mobilization, and how they fit into the picture of how social change works. And so that project is what resulted in This Is an Uprising, which is the book that you mentioned that came out in 2016, particularly with the election of Donald Trump and things like the Women's March and so forth. There's been a lot of interest in that.
Yeah, well timed.
Internationally, you've had a lot of interest as well, and whether that's in Hong Kong, whether that's movements in Spain, et cetera, or other places where they've had mass protest movements, and they're trying to figure out both how to maximize the impact of that, but also how to sustain that over the long haul and link that to kind of ongoing efforts to organize social movement groups. So that's kind of my activism and my writing. The project we've been working on in the last few years has been about what you mentioned about inside-outside politics. So we're coming from a social movement background, people who are kind of organizing as opposition outside the formal political system, but who have decided at various points to interact. They need a strategy for interacting with mainstream politics. So a lot of times these are movements who are pushing for change from the outside, but also say, hey, we need a way to get some of our champions into elected office and have an interplay between those who are on, working within mainstream institutions and those who are protesting from without. And so a lot of our recent work and our next book will be about that topic.
Well, this is fantastic. And I think that, what's always drawn me to your work was the fact that we're looking at social movements, not just at the moment, as you say in your book, as like the moment of the whirlwind when everything just seems like a spontaneous uprising. So I think that's how most people who are not intimately involved in organizing experience social movements or these kind of moments, because we don't necessarily see the years and years of work, right, and strategy and histories and legacies. And I think especially with the devastation of the labor movement in the United States, which had long been one of the sources of memory and education for the strategies and organizing, right? But also the civil rights movement, the Highlander School for Social Research. One of the things that I remember I did research on for my dissertation was on these kind of like alternative school histories within the United States, everything for the modern schools back in the, early part of the 20th century, through the Commonwealth colleges in the South to the, Highlander School for Social Research, where we saw these institutions that are relatively unknown throughout American history, but that were instrumental for these different movements. And your book, This Is an Uprising, but also then this article here, gets into this nitty gritty to help us have these moments from my perspective at least, to reflect and to strategize in what almost a kind of a more, I hate to use these words, but like from a more kind of say mature social movement perspective. That is when we're reflecting back upon what has happened and not just waiting for the next kind of random uprising, but saying, how do we actually do this in a conscious way? So I thought, and it's interesting, I'm so glad to hear that you're working on this for your next book, because it seems that your books have also tracked these various different moments where are kind of asking key questions that movements are asking. And so can you talk a little bit about that? And so you've already spoken to a little bit, but you're looking at this inside-outside strategy and looking at, say, from the perspective of social movements. Can you talk a little bit about that opposition that we often see between people trying to feel they have to make a choice between social movements. Do you do outside the system or inside the system? And why should we be considering, or why should social movements at least be considering this kind of inside-outside strategy as one of the paths forward? It's clearly not the only one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so, you know, the type of the overall perspective that we try to promote is what we call social movement ecology, or creating an ecology of change. And part of this is saying there's no one single organizing tradition or one single approach that's going to make change. But in fact, creating social change involves the interplay of people doing a variety of different things. So those mass protests and those moments of wide scale disruption are very important, but those have to interact with long-term building of institutions, you know, unions and community groups. They need to interact with, you know, alternatives, countercultural efforts to create alternatives outside of the mainstream institutions. They need to connect with efforts at personal transformation and education, and they need to connect with people doing the inside game and you know, and engaging in insider politics. So that's a lot of our work, is actually to look at the interplay between those, but all from, you know, kind of a social movement perspective, writ large. And so, you know, in terms of that opposition, you know, it's certainly a tension that we see throughout social movement, you know, history. Do you pursue change from the inside or from the outside, or from some combination? And we're champions of the outside. We're champions of social movements and people who are, you know, who reject just the idea of the way to create change is to become a lawyer and file a lawsuit, or to, you know, join the party and, you know, just run for office, and, you know, just kind of the standard liberal assumptions about how our democracy works. You know, we accept an outsider critique that, in fact, the system is kind of broken in a fundamental way that's tilted against working people, that's tilted against marginalized communities, and that there is something deeply flawed, and that we need a conception of democracy that's much more robust than just going to vote every 2 years or every 4 years, and that social movements are a very, very important part of that. So we accept that outsider critique, and that's where we're coming from. You know, we're coming from traditions of organizers and activists who are organizing outside, who are putting pressure on the system, who are trying to hold, you know, people in power accountable, and so forth. Now, one thing we see, though, is, you know, when you have these activist communities on the outside, there's a tendency that they can become very self-isolating, right? You know, you create a community that's in resistance to mainstream politics, that's in resistance to mainstream values, they're upholding, you know, countercultural norms, and you know, and to maintain that critique, they have to build a very strong kind of group identity that sustains people on the outside. But the cost of that is that, in this, you know, there's lots of people who talk about this. One of them here in PA is Jonathan Matthew Smucker, who I think you know. He talks about the political paradox, political identity paradox, where you build up a strong identity in these activist communities that sustain people in resistance, that allow them to have countercultural values and allow them to maintain a critique of the mainstream system. So on the one hand, that's a strength, but on the other hand, in maintaining that identity, you become a gatekeeper where the community is constantly trying to hold people to ever more puritanical standards to kind of maintain the integrity of their group. And that ends up cutting them off from their ability to communicate with the mainstream, and ultimately to have a wider influence that goes outside of the life of the group. So in my own personal experience, you know, growing up around the Catholic worker movement, which I mentioned before, I mean, this was a movement started by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. You had, you know, communities of religious people who would do hospitality for the homeless, and then they would also do, you know, do activism. A lot of it was anti-war activism. So when I was growing up, they were doing anti-war activism and nonviolent direct action in the plowshares tradition, which was a movement that took literally this biblical injunction to beat swords in the plowshares. So they would sneak onto military bases, for example, outside of Omaha, and they would take a hammer and try to hammer on the warhead, you know, of a missile, or in the wing of a plane or whatever, and then, and then they would get arrested, doing these things. They were very bold actions, and they were very risky actions. And these people would spend years at a time going to jail for their beliefs. And these were the same communities that also included the Berrigans that poured blood on draft file or liberated files from the FBI that revealed COINTELPRO and things like this. So there's a great tradition of this, but the way we witnessed it was people doing these anti-nuclear, anti-military actions where they would do risky actions and go to jail for years at a time. And on the one hand, we really admired that the community was able to build up this whole support network to produce people not only who are willing to do these very bold actions for what they thought was right, but then would support them, and support families and stuff when people went to jail for long periods of time. So that, on the one hand, was very admirable. But on the other hand, as we got more serious about politics and we started looking at, well, what's the political strategy here? How does this stuff actually create change? And, and kind of what we would start to feel is that these communities were very isolated and they didn't have a real strategy. And sometimes they even developed a rhetoric defending that. So they would say things like, there's even a saying, Jesus didn't tell us to be effective. Jesus told us to be faithful, or, they talk about speaking truth to power or bearing witness, and it was kind of all about being this voice in the wilderness and standing up to power. But as
there was literally, that publication called Voices in the Wilderness, right? I mean,
right. And so as my brothers and I got more involved and we ended up in places like the labor movement, because we said, well, we need, that sort of moral righteousness is needed, but we also need strategies to actually kind of engage, we do need to worry about being effective, not just faithful, right?
Exactly.
We can't just be speaking truth to power. We have an obligation, if we're serious about these issues in this fight for justice, to actually make sure that we're having serious impact, And so, and then the other thing I would say about that is in this mass protest tradition, if you go back to the global justice movement protests, through anti-war stuff, through Occupy, there was a real kind of anarchist ethos in these mass protest movements. You can see this most recently very clearly in Occupy. It was kind of a rejection of the two-party system. A lot of, and a lot of it was justifiable critiques of Democrats, but because of this, there was a real aversion to engaging with electoral politics in any respect, or to a real fear, kind of exaggerated fear of co-optation, that any politician that's kind of using our language or taking up our issues is co-opting us. So rather than looking at this as like, oh, well, we're being successful in influencing the entire political conversation by the fact that all of these opportunistic politicians now want to talk about the 99% versus the 1%, or talk about the issues that, of inequality or debt or mortgage crisis or whatever else. That wasn't seen as a victory. That was seen as, we're being co-opted by the mainstream. So that was not the only political current or political tendency, but it was one that kind of anarchist ethos was very prevalent in these mass protest movements that we wrote about, that we studied, and that we were a part of as activists. And that really kind of started to change, kind of around Bernie Sanders' 2016 run, subsequently with the election of the Squad and AOC. Internationally, you saw this with Podemos in Spain, with movements in Greece, with the Jeremy Corbyn campaign in the in the UK.
Okay.
And then if you go back further, of course, there's a much longer tradition of this in Latin America, where out of the global justice movement, you had left governments, or what were called pink tide governments, that basically took over 60% of the countries in Latin America, where you actually had leftist governments, ranging from kind of center left to really quite far left governments, and made very serious policy changes in these countries. But it took us a long time in the U.S. to catch up with that, what they were doing in Latin America in 2005. It wasn't kind of till after Bernie Sanders in 2016 that there became a real interest on the left, and you saw the revival of things like DSA, Democratic Socialist America. You saw the rise of Justice Democrats trying to run people for Congress. Came out of brand new Congress or a merger of a few different groups. You see it with Sunrise and environmental movement that's also trying to elect progressive champions. You see community organizing groups that have been around for a long time that maybe were part of traditions that didn't, that saw themselves as separate from electoral politics. They've started to form 501c4 groups and to develop a theory of movement politics. So you've seen this move kind of away from that dominant anarchist ethos to a place where people are very interested in talking about how do we have an inside-outside strategy? How do we have inside politics not being the only thing that we're doing, but being a part of it, is being in dialogue or in relationship in some way with the outside movements that we have going on. And so that's really what's inspired our most recent project is to look at to look at that maneuver, to look at that shift, to talk about people being interested in inside-outside stuff, being interested in incorporating inside game stuff into a social movement strategy, and then to talk about that, right? And say, well, then what concretely does that involve? What are the kind of ideas that we need, conceptual ideas and practical organizing strategies that we need to actually operationalize that? What makes an inside-outside strategy effective? And so this article that you mentioned, Can We Stop Movements from Selling Out, is just kind of one part of that bigger project, but it talks about a number of things related to that.
Well, let's get into that, because this is exactly one of the things. What I really liked about what you're doing here is like not only just say, okay, we need an inside-outside strategy, right? And just say, okay, we just need this. So there needs to be some people on the inside, some people on the outside. But asking that next question, okay, how do we understand this, right? How do we actually kind of figure out what causes politicians to actually kind of leave their roots, right? What causes politicians to become co-opted by the system? Why is it that so often that social movements or people or activists always talk about being let down by politicians once they get inside? But instead of it just being about, okay, like they just sold out, they're just kind of, they lost the faith, or they were lying to us all there, looking at some of these concrete ways that, look, there's real pressures, right, that are on politicians, especially when we're talking about Washington politics, but to a lesser degree at state houses too as well. But Washington politics, but to say we want to analyze this, understand it, so that movements, right, can intervene, right, and change that dynamic. And you rely upon, you go back to kind of like, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's piece, and when they're looking at what was going on in the media and seeing their frame of references and looking at these 5 filters as being applicable to what we're talking about and in the political structures. So you talk a little about those 5 filters, and then let's move it into the political realm. And so we talk about how that's happening, how that kind of co-ops local politicians, and then talking about how movements can kind of intervene in that process.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, so context for this. First thing I'd say is most politicians suck. Most politicians suck. The system is effed up, like this is, we have to say this because, as we're talking about the shift from this anarchist, ethos where people didn't want to engage with the inside at all, to arguing, no, movements should be interested in engaging, should take on mainstream institutions and systems of power, and they have to have a strategy for engaging the inside game. So I celebrate that shift, but at the same time, you got to backpedal every once in a while and say, well, the anarchists have a point.
Right, 100%. Yep.
The anarchists have a point, which is that these politicians suck, and that and the system sucks. The system co-ops people, that it's a corrupt, fundamentally corrupt system, and we need to understand that. We can't just naively say like, oh yeah, hey, great, let's just engage in electoral politics. So it starts with that, kind of has to be a profound critique of what is wrong with mainstream politics. There are problems with co-optation. There are problems with bureaucracy. There are problems with the whole political economy of how our politics works. And so movements now that are interested in moving into the electoral arena, they're talking about, okay, well, how do we elect champions? And so this is sometimes called movement candidates. How do we elect movement politicians or movement candidates into office? And that's great. So that becomes, and that acknowledges, okay, well, most politicians don't get the job done, right?
And they're not movement candidates, right?
They're not movement candidates. And it happens, and that we're perpetually disappointed. This happens again and again. We elect someone who we think is going to be good. They kind of say the right things when they campaign, then they get into office, and then they don't deliver. They seem to become part of the establishment. We talk about this primarily in terms of Washington, D.C. and Beltway politics, the culture of Washington. But this is throughout government. This is in state governments, this is local government. This happens everywhere, at different kind of scales. So if we talk about we need movement candidates who are somehow in relationship or in dialogue with these outside social movements, and we need an interplay between the inside and outside, that concept of what is a movement candidate is often very vague, right? And so the purpose of this article and talking about these filters of what is mainstream political culture, what corrupts people in Washington, or what makes people sell out, is a way of being more specific about what is a movement candidate, or what does a movement candidate need to do? How do you create these exceptions to the norm? Every once in a while we get exceptions. There are people with integrity. There are people who push, policies that help disenfranchised communities, that help working people. We do get the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders types and the squad and so forth, but they're the exception to the rule. And so then we talk about, well, what is a movement candidate? And what's important here is we say, well, what a movement candidate is, or a movement politician is not just someone who says the right things. Kind of, they seem to have good politics, or they seem to kind of be with us on the issues. Obviously that's important, but that's not it. And it's also not just where they come from. It's not that they, come from a particular community, or that they have a particular background. Again, that stuff can be important, but it's what we're actually talking about with movement candidate is something more structural. A movement candidate or a movement politician is someone that uses social movements as a base to combat the dominant culture of Washington, D.C., and to combat the things that make people sell out. So that's kind of the premise of the argument. Yeah. But then you get to, okay, well, what is it that makes people sell out? And then we say, well, we have to kind of be more specific about it. We have to drill down and talk about this. And so that's where we turn to Chomsky and Herman. So Chomsky and Herman in the 1980s, some of your listeners may know about this. They have a book called Manufacturing Consent. Subtitle is The Political Economy of the Mass Media. And there's a great documentary about Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent that, if you like documentary form stuff, you can watch this. Or pick up the book. It's still actually a very interesting book, even though it was 1988, so quite a few years ago now. But what Chomsky and Herman do is they're talking about kind of a parallel problem, which is they were looking really kind of in a Cold War context at the mainstream media. And they say, well, what made the mainstream media kind of subservient to Washington, particularly on foreign policy, Cold War foreign policy, or things like the Vietnam War? And what made it kind of this pro-business or pro-capitalist media, right? And they have to ask that question because, we're not, there is some legitimate press freedom and so forth in the United States, freedom of speech. We're not looking at a dictatorial regime or a tyranny where there's a formal state office of censorship that's kind of censoring the media. So how was it that you had this very, subservient press that was willing to,
no problem,
support kind of these powers that be that ultimately maintain the status quo? I mean, there's an occasional expose or something, but notwithstanding that, what made the media behave in the way it did? And so they create a model for that where they point out 5 filters, and they say, well, these are the 5 things that kind of filter out dissenting viewpoints and that make up the political economy of the mainstream media. So again, it's more structural. It's not just kind of individuals, people's. It's not a conspiracy of individuals. It's not kind of individual people's morals or values, something like that. There are these structural things in place that kind of produce the type of media that we have. And so they say, well, first of all, the media is owned by the rich. If you look, that's the first one. It's ownership. That's who owns it. So they have a very clear interest in what they want to put out and what they want to defend just based on that. Second of all, the media was driven by advertising. That's how these papers, how these networks and stuff existed, is that they needed to bring in advertising dollars, and that meant corporate advertisers. And that meant if you did a bunch of critical stories about General Motors or about 3M or about whatever big corporation,
Dow Chemicals,
you were, yes, exactly, you were in great danger of, having them yoink their advertising revenue, which was a serious problem. It strikes at the heart of what a lot of these papers are living on. So you have ownership, you have advertising. The third thing they talked about is this culture of expertise, where media deferred to official sources in Washington and official sources in the business world as being kind of credible voices, while critics outside of that were often not seen as serious people or part of this, kind of credible world. So, famous reporters would even trade in their access, their ability to talk to a senator or a highly placed, person inside the administration, and that this is what would establish their credibility as a journalist, is the access to these kind of powerful people and as sources. And so that culture of expertise created another filter that would kind of weed out things that were not considered part of the acceptable conversation. The fourth filter they had was flack, which was saying if you did do something, that it violated one of these things, there was actual, people would call up. The White House would call up,
like literally
they'd call up the New York Times and they'd yell and scream at the editor, right? Advertisers would call up, so flack is kind of the activation of some of these other filters where you'd actually have an active backlash that would discipline. The media, and even if it doesn't stop them from running a story every time, it does. The editors kind of know that the path of least resistance is not to assign that story that's going to piss off this, administration figure or this corporate advertiser.
And the journalists know it too as well when they're writing their story. That little editor sits on their shoulder in the back of their head, right, as they're actually moving forward.
Yeah, well, and that's a crucial point. Let me come back to that, because that's the way that people internalize these filters is a really crucial thing. But just to name, the fifth filter was Cold War ideology, and kind of anti-communist ideology, which as kind of part of a national religion, kind of anything that was considered too far left was just kind of written off as being socialist, propaganda that was not permissible within the U.S. political thing. Later on, writing after 9/11, Chomsky and Herman wrote something reflecting, I think, on the 25th or 30th anniversary of the book, where they talked about the war on terror becoming another kind of ideological complex that ruled certain opinions impermissible, and that disciplined the media or created a filter that filtered out beliefs. So the idea is these five filters then kind of work in tandem together to kind of screen out dissident views and to marginalize them. It's not that they didn't exist at all, but they weren't part of kind of the acceptable culture of mainstream media. And then there's the point that you bring up, which is that reporters would internalize these things. So they didn't perceive themselves as being censored necessarily, but they just kind of knew the people who were primed to succeed were the ones who kind of knew how this worked, who kind of accepted that this is the way that the rules of the game were played. And then it was just part of their identity of who they were as a journalist, was to kind of operate within these, the confines of the system. So for the most part, there wasn't even a critical, dialogue or engagement with those things, or a feeling that they were violating their own principles. It's like, well, no, this is just kind of what I've been trained for. This is what I do. They consider themselves like objective journalists, and then objective journalists would just be, well, we need to call the important sources on this. Well, who are the important sources? And again, the filters are in play. What we tried to do, what my brother Paul and I tried to do in this article that we just wrote, a month or so ago, in talking about what makes politicians in Washington, D.C. sell out, is kind of do a parallel thing, to take these five filters and say, well, there's kind of an analog of each of these five filters that creates Washington culture, right? So if we ask, well, why are politicians, why do they get sucked in? Why do they become part of the machine? Why do they not speak out in the ways that we want? These are the things that discipline people, or that create not only a cultural force, but a political economy that determines who is part of the mainstream politics. And this is very important if we want to talk about movement candidates, because movement candidates then are defined as being able to resist these things. And the way that they're able to resist is through social movements. So I'll talk more about that in just a second. But just to say what the five filters are. Are we doing all right, Kevin?
Yeah, we're doing great.
So the five filters then, taking these same things. So their first filter was ownership. And we could say, well, in the US, the analog of that is kind of the two-party structure. This is kind of locked in by all sorts of reasons. Election law, first past the post voting and so forth. But you have these two dominant parties, and new members have to operate within these parties. You have structures of seniority. You have structures like the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and the Republican counterpart that very quickly, when you get to Washington, you realize you have to defer to the party leaders and the senior members of the parties. This is even, in a global context or in a European context, U.S. parties are actually quite weak. There aren't, really formal structures of disciplining members in the same way that there might be in other places. However, even here, there's lots of things that the party can do to either favor up and coming people that they like or to marginalize dissidents that they don't like. So if you come in bad mouthing centrist colleagues or party leadership, you're going to be kind of on the outs of that. And that can mean a lot of things. That can mean not getting your committee assignments that you want. That can mean, not getting money from the Democratic Party campaign committees. It can mean local parties not endorsing you, even though you're the Democratic nominee. And we see examples of that, we saw some actually out in Pittsburgh.
Summer Lee.
With Summer Lee. We saw some up in New York where the Democratic establishment essentially abandons this was in Rochester, right?
Yep.
Where they abandon a candidate, even though they win the Democratic Party nomination, they've won the vote.
Buffalo for the mayor. The mayor
sorry,
of Buffalo. Yeah.
My mistake. So we see these examples where the party apparatus itself will abandon progressives, will abandon dissident, candidates who do not fall in line and kind of operate within that structure. So that's a first filter is the party structures. The second, which relates, is campaign finance. This is maybe the biggest. This corresponds when Edward and Herman and Noam Chomsky talk about advertising in the media. Campaign finance, the whole system's awash in money. Yeah. And this influences everything. We know this. This is not a news flash. We've talked about this before Citizens United in 2010. It gets much worse after 2010 when the Supreme Court says that you can basically have unlimited private money in elections. There's very few limits on campaign finance. And so now, politics is a big money business. You have to raise millions and millions of dollars. In 2016, it was $4 billion went into House and Senate races. That's probably now, 7-8 years later, that's going to be a completely antiquated figure.
Totally. Yep.
And so now politicians spend, in DC, you spend hours of your day on the phone with wealthy donors. That's what politicians do, arguably more than they're on the floor of Congress. Yep. There are call centers that are right in Washington, D.C., right across the street from the Capitol building, and you're expected to go in for hours a day and dial for dollars. Now, the funny thing about this, and in the article, we mostly quote Republicans talking about this, right? Because
I love that. I love that the big board. You walk into the meeting, and here's the tally of how much money you've brought in, right? Coming from Republicans.
That's right. Republicans hate this too. Democrats also hate it. But I'm like, well, let's not quote the Democrats, kind of low hanging fruit. Let's quote the Republicans who hate this. And they'll say it. They'll say, I have to come in and shill for wealthy donors. I used to have to do this an hour a day before Citizens United. Now I have to do this 2, 3, or more hours a day. Is this how I spend my day on the phone? We're calling the businesses, the lobbyists for the businesses that we are responsible for regulating. And there are people, Ryan Grimm in his book, We Got People, talks about this. There's kind of this moment where people were like, even again on the Republican side would say, people would be like, can we actually do this? Is this really ethical that we're, calling up these lobbyists who are like trying to lobby? And they're like, well, that's the way the game is played now, and that's on both sides of the aisle. It's with Democrats as well. That idea of raising money is not just raising money for your own campaign. Then you have to raise money to fund the party. Right. And committee assignments. So your power as a legislator is directly tagged to how much you're donating. I mean, it's informal, so it's not formally tagged, but this is pretty much openly acknowledged in Washington that if you want to get on a big committee, you better be able to raise a lot of money, and you have to help the party. You have to help the campaign committee to shore up your majorities or shore up your chances of securing a majority in Congress or in the Senate. So it's fundamentally corrupt. We know it. We know. This is not news to anyone. again, McCain-Feingold. So this was, when, I don't know, you're old enough to remember this, Kevin. I'm old enough to remember this. This is like early 2000s. You had both. You had a high-profile Democratic senator and a high-profile Republican senator. They both said this is a system of legalized extortion and legalized bribery. And they tried to have kind of a moderate bipartisan thing, which is now post-Citizens United is essentially defunct, right? Yeah. So, there's lots of aspects of that, but as a filter, this is maybe the biggest one. Money permeates the whole system. So we have a quote from Bernie Sanders where he says, I caucus with the Democrats. I've gone to these meetings every week, and every week, there's an item on the agenda where we spend whatever it is in an hour meeting. We might spend 10 minutes talking about fundraising. Well, what have we raised? What are the, what's the money? What's the party? He said, in 6 years of going to these meetings, I have never heard 5 minutes of discussion about organizing. What doors are we knocking? What are we doing in Florida? What are we doing in Georgia? How are we getting people out? How are we building up the infrastructure of organizing? There's none of that, right? It's all, it's where's the money? So that's the second big filter. Now, the third filter is expertise. So this, again, kind of plays into the same thing that Chomsky and Herman were talking about in the media. There is this collection of think tanks, of legislative advisors, of technocrats, of campaign managers who create this kind of conventional wisdom. Some people talk about this as the Overton window, kind of what is the range of acceptable policy options. And then there are certain things that are just completely outside. So single payer healthcare is just outside. It's not taken serious, not serious policy. It can't even be discussed seriously because it's not accepted in this kind of Washington think tank world. And of course, this relates to the money because a lot of these think tanks are funded by wealthy people, or they're funded by businesses or whatever else. But those are the people that are hired, in these offices that are taken seriously. And so that's another filter. So we have a quote from AOC, from Ocasio-Cortez. She goes to this session at Harvard when she's elected in 2018. And it's a training session for how to be a congressperson that's held at the Kennedy School, the Institute for Politics or whatever. And she's tweeting from it. And I think another member of the squad is too. And and she says, okay, well, what's the number of corporate CEOs who have come to talk to us about how to be a legislator? 4. How many labor leaders have come to talk to us? 0. And that's
I remember her tweeting out from that. I mean, providing and doing little live streams from this to basically show this is actually what's going on. It was like the world that we never ever see, but nonetheless, this is the infrastructure. This is one of these filters. Absolutely.
Yeah, and you have some people who even, movements have shifted the window. There are lots of things now where kind of free market orthodoxy in 2000 or even 2010 is in a very different place now, in part because of mass movements, part because of Occupy Wall Street, things like this, where market fundamentalism was just taken for granted. And even people like Obama will admit that now. He'll say, well, yeah, when I came in, we were still operating in this kind of post-Reagan bubble where, kind of pro-market solutions were considered to be the only acceptable options. And he's like, maybe that wasn't quite warranted. It's a very mild self-rebuke, but what it leaves out is the fact, I've been involved with think tanks, places like the Institute for Policy Studies in DC. So you do have left-wing, voices that are kind of trying to intervene in this, but, from a pretty far out place, a pretty marginal place. And so what people, what the mainstream politicians, when they do these very mild mea culpas, it's kind of infuriating because, you could say, look, I could have put you in touch with a dozen experts at the time who were telling you exactly this, that we actually need to crack down on Wall Street, or that the invasion of Iraq would be a disastrous thing. There's dozens of Middle East experts that would tell you this, right? It's not like, oh, now it's 2005, whatever. 2 years later, this has been a disaster. Who could have known? It's like, God damn it. We did know, and we told you that. You just didn't listen. And these people were not considered, the people who were saying this is going to be a disaster were not considered the credible voices, So we have quotes in the article about that. So the fourth filter is flack. It's kind of the same thing. Flack's what happens when you kind of violate these other things. You get cut off. Your access is cut off from the party leaders. You get denied the committee assignments. You have corporations dumping money into your opponent's campaigns. They run a referendum or a recall against you. All of those kind of mechanisms to hold people in line when they step outside of these filters. Then the last filter was anti-communist ideology. We think you need to talk about ideology a little bit in a way that's a little bit more broad. It's not strictly anti-communism. Chomsky and Herman also mentioned the war on terror, but it's also things like, mass incarceration, defund the police is considered kind of verboten, or there's lots of things that are just kind of ideologically placed out of bounds. But red baiting and anti-communist stuff is still very relevant. That hasn't gone away. It's changed a lot, particularly since Bernie Sanders 2016, and now you actually have open socialists around in a way that there always were some. We always had the kind of Ron Dellums type figures, or Bernie was around, as a U.S. rep or whatever. But even though kind of dialogue about socialism has changed a lot, anti-communism stuff is still at the fore of Republican rhetoric. They passed a resolution in February, just kind of with ridiculous language about how, here, I'll read a quote. Congress denounces socialism in all of its forms and opposes the implementation of socialist politics in the United States of America. And it's, paragraph after paragraph about this, right? And not only do all the Republicans sign on to this, but more than 100 Democrats in the House sign on to this thing. Now, some of them maybe had tactical reasons. They just said, this is stupid. I'm not going to allow this to be a distraction, whatever. But still, it just illustrates that this stuff is still there. So if you're promoting a single payer healthcare, that's socialized medicine. If you're promoting the Green New Deal, this is creeping socialism. Student loan forgiveness, socialism. Whatever.
Anything that's going to benefit people, socialism.
Yes, exactly. Right. So these are the 5 filters that we're trying to say make up the culture of Washington and discipline politicians. So politicians that go in that seem like they're okay people, that maybe we thought that they were a pretty decent candidate, that maybe talked to the right issue. They go in and they run up against a brick wall with this stuff.
Right.
They have to play the game with the party. They have to raise millions and millions of dollars. They have to cozy up with industry to make that happen. They hire advisors or they get their policy briefs from people who are kind of centrist, policy experts. They buy into, this is just how it's done. If you're a serious person, this is the range of policy positions that you can have. Most politicians are not equipped to deal with any of that.
Right.
And then they get flack. If they do try to do something, they get flack. So immediately they're disciplined. And then there's the anti-communist stuff, or there's efforts if you step out of line, if you criticize Israeli policy, whatever, where there's a mechanism where people are disciplined. And most politicians, as I was just saying, are not equipped to handle any of this. They're not policy experts necessarily, or even if they do have an area of expertise, most issues they don't. They have to rely on people, right? They have to get their advice from somewhere. So they hire people that are in that world of expertise because they're told this is just the way Washington. You need people who understand how things work. You need people who understand the way things actually get done. What can actually pass. If you want to be a serious politician, this is the way you need to operate. If you want access to the people in Washington who actually have power, this is the way you need to operate. And so even people who are, maybe people with good values, maybe people who said the right things, maybe people who come out of communities, working class communities, or people of color or other disadvantaged communities, they run up against a brick wall with all of that. And often they have very, very little support to deal with it. So this is what it means to be a movement candidate. What it means to be a movement candidate is to use social movements as a base of power that can counteract each of those 5 filters. Now, this is not to say we're always successful, because this is like a hellishly difficult problem, all sorts of complexities and difficulties of doing that. But if we're going to define what a movement candidate is, it's not saying the right things. It's not being a certain type of person or having a certain type of value. It's more structural. It's looking at these structural filters and then saying, okay, social movements provide a base for combating each of these things, right? So with the party structures, well, you have social movements that are forming progressive caucuses,
right,
that are forming factions with things like the Squad are part of this, where you go in, with Justice Democrats, there's actually support where you're not alone. You can caucus with people. You can join. I mean, even the Progressive Caucus has gotten a lot stronger at the federal level, and they're forming these at the state and city level. Maybe, here in Philly, we have a city council rep who's part of the Working Families Party, right? Yep. Again, this creates an entirely different orientation for how you're going to interact with party structures, right? Which is not to say in every case you're going to be a third party person or refuse to interact with the Democrats. You might be a Democrat, but you have a way of bucking, kind of centrist party leadership, or bucking the norms of what the status quo in Washington is.
Well, and one of the things that you point out there, just quickly, is that you do say in here that one of the tenets of social psychology too, as well, is that when you looking around, there's other people around you, right, that are mirroring back. Say, I'm paraphrasing here, but mirroring back kind of your own values. It becomes easier to kind of live within that world. And I think this is exactly to your point, right? Is these caucuses and so on. It's like you're not just going in there as this kind of like single person standing alone in the wilderness, but you're actually there and there's others around us. And what's interesting about each of these things, and I don't want to kind of I don't want to kind of send you off track here, but one of the things that I think is interesting about each aspect of these, say, social movement candidates is not only is there a kind of, there's something here for, say, okay, I want to be that social movement candidate, something for the candidates, but it also is a guide a little bit for social movements about the kind of infrastructure, the kinds of organizations, the kind of work that needs to be done. And if we are going to engage in this kind of inside or outside strategy, the kind of really concrete things that movements can do, right? And to at least build out that base to make this more of a possibility to be successful.
Well, that's exactly right. And this is not just this one article, but other articles that we're writing about. So we're writing about, for example, this model that's called co-governance, and people talking about co-governance is a certain language that people are using to describe what the relationship between social movements and politicians should be. So in a way, this is kind of expanding on that discussion. But part of that co-governance discussion is that movements, activists fall into traps of their own with this, like where kind of, we get excited about someone, we elect them, and then they're off on their own. I think Maurice Mitchell at Working Families Party, he says it's like dropping off the kids at daycare. It's like, you send them off in Washington, and it's like good luck. Good luck out there, and then we kind of forget about them. There's so much grassroots mobilization. I mean, this is a critique of electoral politics. You have so much mobilization up into an election cycle. You're mobilizing volunteers. You're building up stuff. Then you have an election, win or lose. There's demobilization. People don't sustain that energy. They don't create structures for continuing that. Instead, it's either we lost, which is like total demoralization and everyone goes home depressed, or we won, great, and then bye-bye. It's sending the person off. And there is very little in terms of sustained engagement with this person until they disappoint us, right? We send them off. We want them to do the right thing. Maybe they're okay, but then they take some vote that we don't like. And there's lots of constituencies, so maybe different constituencies are divided in what's acceptable and what's not. But somehow they take a position that we don't like, and then this is what we call the pressure accountability model. We put pressure on them and we hold them accountable. So they do something that we don't like, and then we protest them or we call them out, or somehow we try to hold them accountable, right? And it's this very, very limited model of how to be in relationship with these politicians, particularly when they're people that we're electing as movement candidates. We forget about them and then we get pissed off at them,
Yep.
And that's harmful both on our side, because it is disillusioning and it's demobilizing, but it's harmful on the elected side, because sometimes we do have people who come out of, or good people and maybe even come out of movement structures. We send them off and then they're kind of like on their own, and they don't have the support. They don't have ways to resist all these filters. And then they take a vote that we don't like, and then they're getting protested. We're pissed off at them, and they're like, "What the fuck?" Pardon my language. But they're like, there's no idea of like we're standing with this person or we're backing them up. It's like we're just pissed off at them, right? And what that does is it creates this thing where, which again is kind of common in mainstream politics, where you're just trying to keep everybody happy. You're trying to appease, appease these constituencies, and the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so social movements in that pressure accountability model just become another squeaky wheel. They're just one among many, constituencies to appease, right? So it's not that movements won't get anything. They'll be noisy about something, or they'll make a demand and they might get it, but they're not in some sort of sustained relationship where they're actually pushing progressive politics, where they have a champion who's operating with movements, who sees themselves as part of movements, that's working on the inside in conjunction with outside. So yes, it is about politicians having a sense of loyalty and ongoing relationship. So it comes from that side, but it also comes from movements. What are the sort of supports that we need to be providing our people? What is the sort of infrastructure that we need to have in place so that we actually can have politicians that succeed?
100%. And I think that, so much of this seems so important as we move forward, like I said at the beginning of this, for the municipal elections and into 2024, really building that sustained stuff. And I think that what I also found so hopeful about this piece, right, is that it actually points into directions of things that we need to build. It was one of the things we had, someone who I have on the show is one of my co-hosts on Fridays periodically. She had went and attended one of these one of the right-wing organizing like groups that's in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And they have these kind of open forums and kind of take them in and have all these folks in. And she kind of went in expecting it to be, like a shit show of people saying all these kind of crazy things. But instead, what it was a home, and they were teaching practical skills about the levers of power, right? They were building an army in a sense, right? But these folks felt connected to it. They felt purposeful. And in this case, their primary target was the Bucks County Republican Party, right? They were like, we got to get rid of these leadership. They had an understanding of what it means to kind of work as a movement. And what I saw in your piece here is that the kind of moving in that kind of direction of thinking about really these concrete structures that movements can be part of, right? Because I also think there's a place where we as movements need to be thinking about providing our, creating these spaces of home, if you will, right? Out of which we grow candidates, right? Out of which we kind of like, people are not just like, we're picking someone at a time of election, but people are coming out of these movements where there's an organic relationship between a potential, say, movement candidate and the movements themselves.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think, there's a number of interesting points on that. One is looking at the right and looking at what the right does on this. In some cases, the right wing has more sophisticated structures for dealing with some of this stuff than we do. And we should learn from the Tea Party, not ideologically, but, in terms of their organizing. I mean, I think that there is a tendency to look at some of that and just say, well, this is AstroTurf stuff funded by big corporations. And partly that's true. They do have bigger sources of money available to them, and kind of very well funded.
There's always multimillionaires at the top of that structure.
So to that extent, there is AstroTurf stuff that goes on, but we're naive if we think that there is no grassroots base that they've been able to develop to mobilize people in support of reactionary policy, of white ethno-nationalist policy, etc. Like, this is real. This is real, and in some cases, they have structures for doing this that are, may even be better than what we're able to do. So we should learn from that. I feel like there's a way in which we've kind of done step one, maybe, which is like candidate recruitment and candidate training, or at least we're kind of attuned to that, where we kind of understand like, we need to develop better candidates and develop a bench of people who are legit, representatives of social movements, who are, going to run for office. But that really is step one. And some people are thinking a little further than that, but it's still very kind of nascent. Actually, maybe we need to run trainings for staffers, right? Like for people who can run campaigns, for people who can staff legislative offices. There's a little bit of that, and it's encouraging when that goes on. But like, we're still kind of in the infancy in providing that. You have something like ALEC on the right, the American Legislative Exchange, where they have just playbooks full of model legislation, to give to their people. So, you can come in with a whole agenda where the bills are already written, the money's already lined up, you've got your talking points, you've got the ideological justification, they're ready to roll. There have been some efforts on the left to do some type of things like that, but I would say that it's very, underdeveloped with comparison to the right. So yes, all of these things are capacities that we need to develop, and we can go down the line with the filters and say, well, what does it mean? We need to anticipate that our people are going to get flack, from the right, that they're going to be under attack. And we need to be ready for that. And we need to be able to stand up and defend people, which sometimes doesn't happen. Sometimes people are really left hanging and they're on their own when they're, trying to stand up to some of these attacks. And that's very damaging for a relationship between a movement and a politician. We can talk about fundraising. Well, what are the mechanisms of small donor fundraising and things like that we can use? Again, not always 100% successfully, because it's a devilish problem, but that we can give people an alternative to traditional campaign fundraising.
100%. Well, Mark, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time. I kept you much longer than I promised you. Like, I appreciate you sticking around and kind of walking us through this. It's really fantastic. And look, listen, the article is "Can Movements Stop Politicians from Selling Out to Dissent?" And I would recommend, literally, we have community organizations and political organizations. We have, whether it's in townships, whether it's in counties that are revitalizing the kind of, say, whether it's Democratic Party politics or independent movement politics that is happening in communities. This is the kind of stuff that we should all be reading, right? This is the kind of stuff that we use as tools to basically have those discussions and thinking carefully about what we're doing and we're building. That it's not just something that we're relying upon, like what's happening in the next election, so therefore we need to gear up for that election, but how do we actually build these sustained structures around here? And I'm so thrilled to know that this is part of an upcoming book that we're going to see kind of even more of this. So I'm going to be looking forward to that so much. But really, I appreciate all your time, Mark, and all your work.
Yeah, and let me plug, so our website where we have an archive of this, if people do want to read more. Just going to
do this, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you do it.
democracyuprising.com, that's our website. The articles do appear in lots of great publications: Dissent, Waging Nonviolence, The Forge, The Nation, in these times. But if you want a one-stop shop, where we're archiving all of this, that's democracyuprising.com.
Yeah, 100%. You can look through all those books there, all the articles there. Great, fantastic discussion. A resource that is kind of indispensable for kind of movements as we're kind of getting it together. Appreciate all your time, Mark, and thank you for your work. And look forward to seeing the book coming out pretty soon.
Okay, take care.
All right, everybody, this is Kevin Mahoney, creator and founder of Raging Chicken. Remember, you can head on over to democracyuprising.com for all the information. You get links to this article and so many more. Will we be back on Friday for our Friday Politics Roundup? But in the meantime, I wish everybody a fantastic week. Keep up the fight, keep up the struggle. We can build this together. Whoo, here we have it all. See ya!
Let me try my people come. I guess I'll fly away now.